So the difference between an enumerated power and an implied power is enumerated power is very direct and specific. It says what Congress should do. An implied power, sometimes referred to as an expansive power, is a power which is suggestive of what Congress could do, but it's not specifically clear. And a couple of these clauses within the Constitution are important here in terms of what actually happens to the United States Congress in terms of its power over time. And there are three main powers that we need to focus in on. Two of them are implied powers, the General Welfare Clause and the Necessary and Proper Clause. The other one, the Commerce Clause, is actually kind of an enumerated power, but its language is sort of vague. And so you have this kind of bridging of an enumerated power and an implied power into the Commerce Clause. We'll get to the Commerce Clause in a moment, but let's talk about the Necessary and Proper Clause.
So what do we mean by necessary and proper? Well, the courts first took up that question in 1819 in a case called McCullough v. Maryland, looking at whether or not the chartering of a national bank was in fact necessary in order for Congress to carry out some of its enumerated powers. And the Supreme Court decided, in fact, that necessary didn't have to mean absolutely necessary. Necessary could mean convenient, helpful, nice. So necessary and proper doesn't have to mean that Congress has to show that there is a compelling linkage between what it wants to do and what the Constitution gives it authority to do. The Necessary and Proper Clause means that Congress can decide in its own judgment what steps it wants to take in order to carry out a piece of legislation that it's passed. Of course, there are limits to that. The Supreme Court would not permit Congress to do something that otherwise was in violation of a provision of the Constitution. But short of that, if Congress believes it would be helpful to do something in order to help it meet its obligations under Article 1 of the Constitution, the courts have given Congress a lot of latitude in order to be able to do so.
The main question with the Necessary and Proper Clause was, how much latitude do you want to give Congress to fill in the gaps of the enumerated powers? I mean, this is how many of the founders saw the Necessary and Proper Clause, that Congress should do whatever is necessary and proper to carry out, right, some of the enumerated powers. Well, that seemed to be fine at the convention, but it quickly became an issue right away in the first Congress, actually, over the National Bank. And this was an interesting battle because during the convention and during the ratification debates, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison were on the exact same side, arguing for a strong national government and embodying the Necessary and Proper Clause as a key, really, to allowing Congress to build on these enumerated powers and to do what was necessary to solve some of the problems that the country was facing. Madison gets elected to Congress. Hamilton gets appointed Treasury Secretary under the first president, George Washington. And we get our first real battle over what is the meaning of the Necessary and Proper Clause. And Madison took the position that the Necessary and Proper Clause should be limited essentially to the specific powers that Congress were giving. So, for example, if it were necessary and proper, if Congress decided to create, let's say, a Navy and wanted to empower that Navy, it would be necessary and proper, let's say, to build out the naval offices or perhaps give more money or build ships related to them. That's what he understood necessary and proper to be. Hamilton took a very different approach. He said necessary and proper could essentially mean virtually anything that is covered under Article 1, and essentially the broad lawmaking power, including the ultimate implied power, which is the Congress's ability to make the laws. And so you get a sense from Hamilton that you need a Congress that can do things that aren't specifically mentioned, things like incorporation, things like a national bank that might have been put into the Constitution. And Madison could come around and say, well, why didn't we say that Congress had an enumerated power to create a national bank? or a power of incorporation, which was something that was discussed during the convention. And Hamilton said, well, this is something that was left up to future Congresses. And so you get this sense with necessary and proper that it's really not all that clear within a couple of years, actually, of the ratification of the Constitution. And at that time, remember, there's no judicial review specifically laid out in the Constitution. There's a sense in which the court would have the power of judicial review, but it's not specifically stated in the Constitution. And essentially, the first Congress and the Treasury Secretary were trying to decide just exactly what are the powers of Congress right there in real time in the first Congress. Later, in McCulloch versus Maryland, Chief Justice Marshall clarifies what necessary and proper means. The National Bank goes through a few different episodes up until 1819. And here we get a clarification in McCulloch versus Maryland that, yes, in fact, the Congress can create a national bank. And so the necessary and proper clause early on becomes a matter of controversy. It becomes historically an essential power of Congress to do most of the things we think that Congress has done over the years in enacting laws dealing with everything from interstate commerce to laws that allow the federal government to expand upon social programs and the like. So you get in the case of necessary and proper a kernel of a power that either had the potential to be constrained by the enumerated powers or could be opened up to allow Congress to enact laws in a broad range of areas. It turns out historically that essentially the necessary and proper clause becomes something that's protected by the courts and allows Congress to do essentially almost anything it wants to, as long as it can build a consensus within the House and the Senate and get the president's consent. So necessary and proper is very important. General welfare clause fits also into this general frame. What is the general welfare? How do we define the general welfare? And it's left up to future Congresses. There's a bigger point here that's very, very important, and that is that the Constitution could not possibly do everything. Remember, where are we? We're at 1787. You've got 12 delegates from 12 states in Philadelphia trying to figure out, they were all continentalists. They all thought that some kind of national government had to be created. But they're trying to get through this, and they're trying to give the Congress an independent power, but not too much power. And so the idea is, okay, we'll circumscribe certain powers, but at the same time, we want to give ourselves a little bit of flexibility because we don't know what's around the corner. And this is part of the United States Constitution. It's clear in some ways, but it's vague in others. And necessary and proper is one of those areas that lends itself to interpretation, and it's left up to future Congresses to deal with. Same thing is true of the General Welfare Clause. So on those two powers, what we get here essentially is the founders saying, let's figure out how to get to the next stage, and then we can decide what happens later. And so you see that in a variety of areas of the Constitution, but necessary and proper and general welfare clause are essentially two major implied powers that become very expansive.